Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. It's indeed a pleasure to be able to introduce you to Peter Corning. Those of you who don't know him, the newcomers among us, Peter did his undergraduate work at Brown and then a doctorate in interdisciplinary social and life sciences from NYU. He did postdoctoral training in behavioral genetics at Colorado, taught at Stanford while holding a research appointment in the Stanford Behavioral Genetics Lab and Engineering Economic Systems Department. I hope they had a door big enough to hold that title up. And for the past 3 decades, he has directed the nonprofit Institute for the Study of Complex Systems. Now, many of you know Peter and Susan Corning because they are former residents here. And while we don't think of Horizon House in terms of an alumni association, for obvious reasons, they probably come close to qualifying for that as former residents here. So please join me in welcoming Peter Corning, who's going to talk about the Synergism Hypothesis. And hold it up to you.
Yes, indeed. Okay, thank you very much. As you can see from the screen, the title of my talk is The Synergism Hypothesis, and that refers to work that I have been doing for about 40 years, actually a little over 40 years, going back to Stanford, on a concept of evolution that's in sharp contrast with the theory that most of us kind of grew up with, the notion that it's an individualistic process and a competitive process, that competition is the key to evolutionary change. That, in fact, is dead wrong, and there's a lot of reasons, some of which I'll talk about today, for the fact that it is wrong, that in fact it is cooperative effects, which I refer to under the category of synergism or synergistic effects, that are the key to the evolution of complexity from the most basic one-celled animals to complex systems like us. And so without further ado, I'll get to that. Well, I guess I should say, though, that because of the fact that this theory has been around now for 40-odd years, and I've published 4 books on it and dozens of articles and book chapters, this theory has been very well vetted, as it were. Even though it's not well known, or not so well known yet as it will ultimately be, I believe, it is in fact well established. So let's get started. Charles Darwin's famous term, natural selection, is a very clever and immensely useful concept. It's provided us with a framework, a general theoretical framework for understanding how life has evolved over the past 3.8 billion years or so. And it's probably one of the best known concepts in science. However, Darwin's theory doesn't provide us with an explanation for the rise of biological complexity, one of the most consequential trends in the history of life on Earth. The trajectory of biological complexification from, as I mentioned, primitive one-celled life forms to intricate eukaryotes, multicellular organisms, and so on, it requires an additional explanatory principle. Over the years, there have been countless non-Darwinian theories about this trend. Perhaps the earliest modern theorist to advance the idea that there is some inherent aspect of the natural world that leads toward complexity was the early 18th and 19th century theorist Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck. Half century later, the renowned English polymath Herbert Spencer elevated the idea into a universal law of evolution that accomplished really an embrace, I should say, everything from physics to ethics. So this was a very common idea back in the 19th century. Darwin himself, though, was strongly opposed to such law-like deterministic theories. In The Origin of Species, he wrote, "I believe in no fixed law of development." And again, "I believe in no necessary law of development." However, Darwin never specifically addressed the evolution of complexity. And more notoriously, of course, he never talked about the origin of species. He left it to future generations to explain the biological complexity. In the early part of the 20th century, the so-called theory of emergent evolution was advanced as a way of explaining the appearance of, quote, qualitative novelties and, of course, new levels of organization in complexity. Emergent evolution theory had several prominent advocates, but the leading figure in this movement was a comparative psychologist and prolific writer, Conway Lloyd Morgan. Unfortunately, Lloyd Morgan portrayed the evolutionary process as an unfolding of inherent tendencies which he ascribed to divine creation. This was, of course, a vision that was rejected by the biologists of his day. But emergent evolution theory was eventually eclipsed by the rise of the science of genetics in the 1920s and the 1930s. It was, in retrospect, a minor dark age for complexity theory. For much of the 20th century, a reductionist, gene-centered approach to evolution prevailed. It was commonly known as neo-Darwinism. And evolution was portrayed by biologists as a sort of a two-step process. Random mutations were the source of creative change, of innovation, and natural selection simply sorted and decided among which of those mutations would be retained. Evolution was portrayed by a biologist very much as a mutation-centered process. In fact, there was a popularization which has since become legendary, The Selfish Gene by a biologist popularizer, Richard Dawkins. And in it, he portrayed evolution as being all about the machinations of selfish genes. There were some points of light during this period. People who had a different view. J.B.S. Haldane, Julian Huxley, also Lynn Margulis, more recent, who became a champion for the role of symbiogenesis, the idea that symbiosis between two different organisms was the source of evolutionary change. She thought it was the major cause of the evolution of complex systems over time. However, complexity theory reemerged late in the 20th century and was inspired by a new generation of non-Darwinian theorists, mainly outside of biology. For instance, the computer scientist and algorithm pioneer John Holland, in his 1998 book, Emergence, asked, how do living systems emerge from the laws of physics and chemistry? Can we explain consciousness as an emergent property of certain kinds of physical systems? Likewise, the well-known theoretical biologist Stuart Kauffman, in his early writings, although he has since come to his senses, shall we say, also aspired to discover the underlying laws of evolution, although he too could only offer us a kind of a promissory note. In his popular book in 1995, At Home in the Universe, Kauffman asserted that, quote, order is not accidental, that vast veins of order lie at hand. Laws of complexity spontaneously generate much of the order in the natural world. Order, vast and generative, arises naturally. He called it order for free. There have been many other variations on this idea over the years, that there is some inherent characteristic in nature or in biological systems that leads to the increase in tendency to increase in complexity over time. And that natural selection doesn't have anything to do with it. It happens automatically, as it were. The problem is that these theories explain away the very thing that needs to be explained, namely the contingent nature of living systems and their fundamentally functional and adaptive properties. The purveyors of these law-like theories often seem oblivious to the inescapable challenges associated with what Darwin called the struggle for existence in the natural world, and they discounted the economics, the costs and benefits of complexity, because it costs something to be more complex. Nor can they explain the fact that 99% of all the species that have ever evolved are now extinct. I'm going to get a glass of water here.
We're on the way. We're on the way.
Over the course of the past 2 decades or so, the subject of complexity has reemerged as a major theme in mainstream evolutionary biology, and I understand you had a talk on this subject very recently. And there's been a search underway for what biologist Daniel McShay has called a grand unified theory of evolution that's consistent with Darwin's great vision, but that also provides an explanation for how systems have evolved that is consistent with the idea that they are contingent living systems. As it happens, such a theory already exists. And it was first proposed in my 1983 book, The Synergism Hypothesis, A Theory of Progressive Evolution. And it involves an economic or perhaps bioeconomic theory of complexity. Simply stated, cooperative interactions of various kinds, however they may occur, can produce novel combined effects, synergies, with functional advantages that may in turn become the causes of natural selection. The focus of the synergism hypothesis is on the favorable selection of synergistic wholes and the combinations of genes that produce these wholes. The parts and their genes create these that create these synergies may in effect become interdependent evolutionary causes of evolutionary change. In other words, the synergism hypothesis is a theory about the unique combined effects produced by the relationships between things. I refer to it as holistic Darwinism because it's entirely consistent with natural selection theory properly understood. And just to be clear, natural selection is not a mechanism or some kind of external force. It refers to whatever functional influences are responsible in a given context for causing differential survival and reproduction. So the bottom line is this: it's the functional benefits associated with various kinds of synergistic effects in any given context that are the underlying cause of cooperative relationships and of complex organization in the natural world. The synergy produced by the whole provides the payoffs that may favor the survival and reproduction of the parts and their genes. Biologist Patrick Bateson has illustrated this idea with an analogy. The recipe for a cookie in living organisms, it represents the recipe for a cookie represents a set of instructions for how to make an end product. A shopper who buys of the phenotype, so to speak, the end product, doesn't buy the recipe. He or she buys the end product and are willing to purchase more of them if they taste good. Although it may seem like backwards logic, the thesis here is that functional synergy is the cause of cooperation and complexity in living systems, not the other way around. So to repeat, the synergism hypothesis is basically an economic theory of emergent complexity, and it applies equally to biological and cultural evolution, most notably in humankind. Indeed, in various of my books, I propose the idea that social cooperation has been the key to our evolution as a species, and that the potential for synergy is the reason why we cooperate. In a very real sense, our species invented itself. Biologists John Maynard Smith and Urs Satmari, in their path-breaking book in the 1990s on the major transitions in evolution, came to the same conclusion independently about the causal role of synergy in evolution, although they graciously acknowledged the priority of my book. Maynard Smith also proposed the concept of synergistic selection in a scientific paper he wrote in 1982. He illustrated with a formal mathematical model that included a term for non-additive benefits. When 2 + 2 = 5 or more. The idea was also distilled in the catchphrase, "the whole is greater than the sum of its parts," which can be traced back to Aristotle in his classic book, The Metaphysics. Although, as we'll get to this, you'll see that synergy is much more than a whole that's greater than the sum of its parts. It's just different from the sum of its parts in significant ways that provide functional advantages. But I think the term is useful. Synergistic selection focuses our attention on the causal dynamics and selective outcomes when synergistic phenomena of various kinds arise in the natural world. For its synergy and synergistic selection that has driven the evolution of cooperation and complexity over time, including especially the major transitions in evolution. To borrow a famous expression, the arc of evolution bends towards synergy. Let's take a brief tour of the concept of synergy in the natural world. One commonplace and frequently cited example is water, a versatile liquid that is composed of two elemental gases, hydrogen and oxygen. This is an obvious case where the whole has different properties from the parts, and that those properties are what are significant in many ways in nature. Another example is ordinary table salt. Sodium chloride is a product of two basic elements that are toxic to humans by themselves, the light metal sodium and chlorine gas. But when we mix these two together, they have positively beneficial effects for humans in small amounts. Humans excel at creating novel synergies. Just consider one of our most unique inventions, written language. Depending upon how the letters are arranged, there can be 16 possible combinations of the four English letters O, P, S, and T. Many of these combinations mean nothing to us, like TPSO, OSPT, SOTP, etc. But 6 of them trigger distinct meanings in our minds. Stop, POTS, top, spot, opts, and post. It could be said that the 4 letters cooperate to produce different synergistic effects. Human technology is also full of synergy. Take the alloy chrome, nickel, steel, where, whoops, we're at the end of the slideshow. Oh.
Was that the end of the slideshow?
Yeah, that's
That's
the beginning.
the beginning.
Let's get you right where you need to go here.
There.
On this one specifically. Oh, where's the mouse at? There we go.
Turned itself off because it wasn't.
There we go. That one.
Okay, good. Human technology is also full of synergy. Take the alloy chrome, nickel, steel. Oh, okay. Where the 3 elements together are stronger by about 35% than the sum of each of the constituents separately. And in the bargain, they, of course, have rust-free properties. The nickel strengthens the steel, and the chrome prevents oxidation. But perhaps the most miraculous synergies of all are found in living organisms. Bacteria, arguably the most plentiful organisms on Earth in terms of their total biomass, are the inventors and masters of a great variety of synergistic effects. Among their many firsts, we now know that bacteria pioneered in communal living, in multicellular organization, even the division of labor, or what should probably more accurately be called, excuse me, a combination of labor. For example, the process of converting cellulose into usable nutrients inside the rumen of a cow depends on the combined services of 5 different strains of symbiotic bacteria. 4 of these strains provide different enzymes, each of which accomplishes a specific conversion step, while the 5th strain provides protection for all the others from exposure to oxygen, an ever-present threat to an anaerobic bacterium. So in other words, ruminant animals could not digest the grasses they consume without this synergistic process. Another legendary example of synergy in nature can be found in lichens, which we see all around us. The patchy growths that we see on limbs and rocks and even on fair ground in some woodland areas. Lichens are not actually a distinct species. They're a broad category of symbiotic relationships between different species of fungi and various kinds of green algae or cyanobacteria. There may be 25,000 different lichen varieties altogether, but they're composed of different partnerships. Lichens are renowned for their ability to colonize barren environments, and the key to their success as so-called ecological pioneers lies in their complementary talents. The green algae or cyanobacteria engage in photosynthesis. They provide the energy capturing services for the partnership, while the fungi have capabilities for surface gripping and water storage, talents that are especially valuable in harsh environments. Some years ago, the zoologist Jonathan Kingdon coined a clever title for his book about human evolution. He called it The Self-Made Man. In it, Kingdon documented the growing evidence that various behavioral innovations were keys to human evolution. But what he did not highlight in his book was that many of these innovations were also synergistic. We invented a great many behavioral, cultural synergies that have played a key role in our evolution. We are also the synergistic ape. Anthropologists tend to call this gene culture evolution, which is a good way of putting it. The list of these synergies is long, and it keeps growing longer. It includes group hunting, group fishing and group gathering, group defense and offense, the nuclear family, fire and cooking, tool making and tool use, of course, the division of labor, language, secure home bases, and even political organization. As Aristotle put it, we are also the zoon politikon, a political animal. I devote 3 chapters in my 2018 book called Synergistic Selection to that, and I brought along a copy for your library, so Jack, feel free. To sum up then, it is synergistic selection, not classical natural selection, the individualistic competitive model that has defined the overall trajectory of evolution toward greater complexity over time. The complex systems that have evolved in nature are primarily the result of cooperative functional interventions and their combined economic benefits, not atomistic genetic changes alone. If natural selection is all about selfish genes, to repeat Richard Dawkins' famous metaphor, synergistic selection is all about the joint effects produced by cooperative genes and the consequences of these interactions for survival and reproduction. It's not about cooperation per se, but about the unique economic benefits that arise from cooperation. This new view of evolution is inspiring to me, but I think we must also, at this point, look to the future, because it's now clear that we are at an evolutionary tipping point, a major transition in evolution that Darwin could not have imagined. As the comedian Mort Saul put it, the future is not what it used to be. The challenge we face going forward was forcefully stated by one of the most distinguished political commentators of the 20th century, Walter Lippmann, in a 1969 interview just before he died. His words, more than ever, ring true to me. Quote, This is not the first time that human affairs have been chaotic and seemed ungovernable, but never before, I think, have the stakes been so high. What is really pressing upon us is that the need to be governed threatens to exceed man's capacity to govern. This furious multiplication of the masses of mankind coincides with the ever more imminent threat that because we are so ungoverned, we are polluting and destroying the environment in which the human race must live. The supreme question before mankind, to which I shall not live to know the answer, is how men will be able to make themselves willing and able to save themselves. Almost a half century later, it seems to me that Lippmann's supreme question remains unanswered. I will focus on this global challenge in my next book, a forthcoming book from Cambridge University Press called Evolution and the Fate of Humankind. So stay tuned. Thank you.
The book that Peter mentions, Synergistic Selection, is a gift to our library, and thank you very much, Peter. We'll put it in. And now we'll have open up for a question and answer period. Bill, could you run a mic on this side, and I'll run the mic over here. I'd like to begin the questioning period. In reading over the materials that Peter provided us ahead of time, and by the way, if anyone is interested in, Peter had made available to us a synopsis of the synergistic hypothesis, and if anybody's interested in getting a copy of that, let me know, and I will either send it to you via email or put a copy in your cubbies. So we'll go ahead and take care of that.
Yeah, I think the title was Revisited and Updated.
And updated, right. Revisited and updated.
So it was filling in with a lot of recent developments.
There you go.
Supportive of
Okay, here's my question. Synergies, as you pointed out, is defined when two or more factors interact, yielding a result that's greater than the sum of its part. And the hypothesis states that cooperative effects between various determinants contributed to an evolutionary outcome. So my question is, what's the mechanism of that synergy? What's the mechanism of that cooperation by which a unique, more adaptive, evolving outcome occurs? And the question arises out of the program that I mentioned that we had here several weeks ago on complexity theory. If you remember in that program, they talked about the fact that Alan Turing, better known for his having settled the Enigma code for the German Enigma code in World War II, that he proposed an interesting formula, the likes of which I'd never seen before in mathematics. Not that I'm a mathematician, but what was unusual about it, there was a function in that formula that was neither an equal or a greater than or a plus or minus or less than. It was a function that ran in both directions. And what he was implying by that was that that function might be feedback. And my question is, what is it something like feedback is the mechanism by which these two elements that cooperate, that provide each other with information, and then that information is used to adapt? Could you comment on?
Yes. Well,
Peter?
back to the mic. Cooperation is something that happens in many different ways across living systems. And the incentive for cooperation, if you will, is its positive benefits. Its functional advantages. the first one-celled bacterial prokaryotes that were able to sense the environment and move toward or away a potential food source had a tremendous advantage. And that in time led to us. There were many, many, many steps after that where living systems were differentially selected depending upon which innovations provided them with some functional advantage. Being able to tell whether it's hot or cold, for example, would be a very useful thing to know for a bacterium. So it's the positive functional benefits that are a result or the cause of the selection, the evolution of these traits. And that certainly applies to complexity too. And yes, I guess there is a point in Turing's double equal sign, which simply means that there's feedback, and that is in doubt how living systems over the course of time selected new innovative ways of doing things because they had positive effects which fed back, not necessarily in informational terms, but in terms of the mode of living and the ability to survive. I'm not sure if I answered it all, but okay.
Very good. Thank you.
Okay. I had three reactions to your talk, the first two of which are completely incompatible. The first reaction was the first reaction was he's got it right, and the second reaction was he's got it wrong, and the third reaction is he's got it right, but he's gotten off on a sidetrack, and the sidetrack, as I see it right now, but I could be wrong. The sidetrack is the preoccupation with complexity. If I were picking on Darwin, I wouldn't start by saying that his theory is not complex enough. I think it's plenty complex.
No.
But I think the third theory that I have is that you did get it right, but complexity is not the issue that I would push. What I would push would be relationships. And if you look at humans, the questions that I would be asking is, what did farming do to the development of humans? I mean, 10,000 years ago, people stopped hunting. I'm wrong in some of the details, but 10,000 years ago, people decided that they were not going to be hunter-gatherers so much anymore. They were going to have farms. They were going to live together. And this led to changes in their relationships among each other. And if you look at humans, one of the interesting things, in fact, what makes humans different probably from any other organism is something that might be called theory of mind, which is the idea that I have some thoughts about what you are thinking, and you might have some thoughts about what I'm thinking, and there's some kind of a product.
We now know that animals can do that.
Well, okay.
Some higher animals are capable of doing some of the feats that we think are uniquely human. Yeah, there's been stuff published in several journals just in the last year, including Nature.
I'm interested in your view about the
Can we
mechanism.
stop for just a second and answer this gentleman over here? Okay, go ahead. Yeah. First of all, I think it's important to recognize that humans evolved as small groups long before there was farming. And in fact, there are still some small groups who are hunter-gatherers living today. Most of us, including most of the growth in human societies, has been due to the evolution of farming and so on, and technology. But it is not as though it was one or the other. It was both. And we were a group living species even as we were hunters. In fact, we not only lived in groups, we lived with dogs who helped us with our hunting and guarded our fire sites at night. We were symbiotic with other species, even as we were evolving as hunter-gatherers. The evolution of farming, that's a long story. Having been a one-time farmer myself, I have a soft spot in my heart for it. But farming can be done in a lot of different ways, some of which you might not even recognize. So,
Okay. I'm interested in the mechanism of action for the organism by which the things you're talking about could take place, and wonder what the relationship is between the requirement for heritability of learned things in the course of a lifetime or a generation, and is what is transmitted, is it heritable or is it educational? That is, the farming issue is one that is, I learned from observing what's around me what the best way for me to survive is, and I do it. Or am I not the victim of, but the effect of some of those changes that take place in one generation are inheritable to another?
We aren't sure of this. There are a lot of things that are still back in the mists of the past, but there's been a lot of work done on the notion that humans often learn by imitating others. They see somebody cutting open a clamshell, and they try to do it themselves. And if it works, then they continue to do it. So they learn from what others do, from seeing what others do, and then take it in and make that learning part of their MO.
Things that they observe work and persist. There's no change in the DNA.
No.
Right.
No.
Okay. But there is change in the DNA, and it's my understanding that certain aspects of the DNA are susceptible to heritable change.
Oh, absolutely, including presumably eating clams. What's in clams is absolutely anathema to me. I didn't get that gene or genes. But presumably some other people did because they like clams.
Guess what? Are we on? No.
Push up.
It's not on.
Okay, now it's on. Okay. Well, Peter, I want to thank you deeply for providing us with this wonderful summary of the history of this thought. And when you left Horizon House, we all lost. And so,
Oh, well, thank you.
but I have a couple of comments. One is the history of evolution, evolutionary thinking, has been badgered by bad definitions, and started with Darwin, when he said the book on the origin of species has nothing to do with the origin of species at all.
Yeah.
And in fact, the whole science of speciation, how speciations form, began much, much later using Darwinian principles, but Darwin had absolutely nothing to say about the origin of species. His only point was that species are not immutable, they can change. And of course, he had no example of natural selection at the time because nobody had measured it. But the same is true of Richard Dawkins, The Selfish Gene. He regrets that title. I've talked to him about it because that implies that genes have emotions, which he knows they don't.
Well, he should regret it.
That was a really.
But he made a lot of money.
Yeah,
selling
I mean,
that
it
book.
was.
That's still a bestseller.
That was but it was. It really misled people into a lot of thinking because genes don't have any emotions at all. But my real question is how we can translate these ideas into mechanistic understandings of exactly how things happen. And what are the recent progress that you're seeing enable to understand just how what is the mechanisms underlying this? Because it's still going to be natural selection there because the synergistic things pay off because of survival benefits, et cetera. But where are we in trying to understand the details of the mechanisms?
Which mechanism?
How any of a synergistic effects arise. We know that there's what happens out there with hydrogen and oxygen. Sometimes they bump together, and water occurred, and it turned out to be a great thing. But what's happening at the level of
2/3 of the planet is water. But apart from that,
but there was no guiding principle. Things are bouncing around and bumping together, and hydrogen and oxygen happened to bump together in certain ways, and out came water, and it turned out to be a great thing. Down to the mechanisms of some of these, we're talking about genetic changes underlying synergisms. What sort of progress are we making in understanding some of the details? Because this is unfortunately, like a lot of evolutionary stuff, devilishly difficult to experimentally investigate.
I'm not sure. I hate to say this, but I'm not sure that your question makes any sense.
Tell me why.
I guess it just wasn't talking into it.
Oh, there you go. Hold it up to your mouth.
It has to be lighted. Okay. Yeah, and now I've got it. Where was I?
The question had to do with what's the mechanism by which synergism takes place. Is that right? Yeah.
How well
The-
are we progressing in understanding those mechanisms?
There isn't a mechanism. That's the answer in a nutshell. Synergy is a descriptive term for cooperative functional effects.
Yeah.
I'm still not, okay. It's a descriptive term. How synergy occurs can happen in many different ways. Sometimes, as you said, the random coming together of oxygen molecules and hydrogen molecules in the atmosphere. The atmosphere was full of free-floating molecules which combined over the course of time and formed water, and that in turn led to the origin of life. We now know that was really a key to the origin of life, so that the environment and life have evolved over time in what's now being called a coevolutionary process. And we are much more respectful. In fact, we should have been much more respectful a long time ago of how much the environment and ourselves are in a coevolutionary process. And so there is no mechanism except the functional consequences, or a failure to find consequences, in which case nothing will happen, or nothing will sort of continue, perpetuate. So I'm not sure if I'm really answering you, but I don't think that's the right question.
Maybe we're all cycling around this in different forms of language. I don't know. So is there any development of increasing complexity within a species or among species that couldn't be absorbed within your theory? Is this falsifiable?
I'm going to have to think about that.
It does seem like any example you come up with, well, that it happened. They came together, something better emerged. And the big example.
These days, something is invented. There's an awful lot of invention of synergistic effects going on because humans are very good at figuring out when things are put together that are put together have beneficial effects or poisonous effects, as the case may be. So humans are driving the evolutionary process now. Let's face it. We are playing a key role in evolution. We don't think of ourselves as an evolutionary force, but that's what the human species is doing. And can this be falsified? I'm going to have to think on that.
I don't come from a scientific background, so I'm going to get a little more simplistic. In the development of the hand of humans or the foot, there was some kind of synergistic thing that went on, or imitation, as we developed what we did with those limbs. And then those that were successful were the ones that then put it into an genetic inheritance, so that we did get a change in the structure of the hand or the foot. But it started, I think, with your synergetic imitation of what you do with the hand or what you can do with the hand.
Yeah, I think that's true. The human hand evolved over a long period of time, during which the hand developed, invented, with the help of the brain, invented or learned to do things in different ways, from hanging from branches to making spears to making machine guns. Well, and the hand has changed over time. Yeah. And that, you could call that a form of feedback, if you will. But it's really, I think the term coevolution is a better one, because it suggests that there was an interdependence between the things that were done with the hand and the shape of the hand over the course of time.
Oh, going back to what Andy said,
Yeah.
Is it possible that we're talking about this cooperative synergism could be the result of multiple processes.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Sure.
This is pretty simplistic because I was a C student in college.
Because what?
But as I understand Gordon, he implied that that evolution is basically an accidental process, no intention behind it. And I hear you saying now that we've reached the point as a human species where we're actually actively interfering with the process of evolution. Do I understand that correctly?
I wouldn't use the word interfere, I would use the word we are increasingly influencing the course of evolution. There's a wonderful book by, I forget his first name, Schildhausen, called Darwin Comes to Town. And in this book, he describes at length all the ways in which animals have adapted to human societies and civilization. Many of the species that we're familiar with evolved with us. As we changed the environment, they changed as well. But yes, we now, humans are changing, for better or worse, are changing the environment in many ways that may affect the course of life on Earth. We may not be able to continue surviving if we continue to do what we're doing to the environment.
An exciting example of how we've domesticated mammals as well. If you go, I've seen this happen with hunters, with a dog out there, and the hunter is down the goose, and the dog looks and the hunter is giving directions as how to get there, and the dog can follow that. If you raise a baby wolf and out there, it can't do it.
Yeah.
It just simply can't do it. But
and sheepdogs are wonderful
also,
to watch.
but the question you didn't sound terribly hopeful at the end. Do you think synergistic thinking has a hope of saving us?
It's going to take more than that. Well, this is the subject of my next book. I have a final large chapter in that book called Unite or Die. And it's taken from a phrase that Benjamin Franklin used shortly before the Revolutionary War. And he was right. The colonies, by coming together and forming a union to fight against the British, were ultimately successful and achieved independence. And now we are facing a similar problem on a global level. We are every day experiencing environmental phenomena that are very disruptive, that individual societies can't handle by themselves, and they're having effects on many other societies. You know, when a drought occurs in Africa, everybody immigrates out of Africa to find a place where food grows. So it is, in fact, a global problem now. And ultimately, there really are two courses if we, look at the history of the human species. We either unite and cooperate to solve these problems or to deal with these problems, or we end up fighting each other. War is one of the most prominent characteristics and frequent events in human history and prehistory. We're also a warlike species, and we don't like to admit that, but look around you. So that's the dilemma we face. Are we going to end up fighting each other, or are we going to unite and try to solve these problems?
On that pregnant question, we'll leave the Well, in this session, thank you very much, Peter. Thank you and welcome back. Nice to have you here. Thank you.